Now we shall move on to the Q&A segment. So may I invite all the speakers to switch on their videos as well as their microphones. I hope everyone has enjoyed the short sharings that we've all conducted. And I see a couple of questions here coming up on the board here. So I think the experimental approach shared by Hongyi just now was really interesting because it really showed how a small team of people can manage to build products that can impact thousands in Singapore, or even hundreds of thousands in Singapore. So there's one question here from Ing Chen, who is from Singapore. Hi, Ing Chen. So question is, what is it like to build products in government with all the big systems you have to work around and coordinate with? Can you truly be experimental?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that a little bit. So it's definitely not trivial. I would say the way to think about this is that a lot of experimental stuff has to happen like on the edges, right? So you have to think about it like compromising a system. The government bureaucracy is designed very much to enforce sort of current government operation, which is how it's meant to go. And so if you're trying to get government to work differently, it's like trying to get a computer system to work differently, which is that you try to identify vulnerabilities in how the protocols work and then exploit those vulnerabilities in order to achieve results. And so in the case of our team, right, a lot of what we do is we try to build our products on like under $6,000 and like do demos under $6,000 because $6,000 is the magic number for small value purchases. And small value purchase, and if something's under small value purchase, you like bypass a whole bunch of bureaucracy in terms of getting funding approval. Similarly, a lot of our efforts in terms of privacy are not just like privacy efforts, but they are bureaucracy bypassing efforts. Because if I collect personally identifiable data, that increases the amount of bureaucracy I have in terms of security audits and things like that. So if I can find a way to like design my app to actually minimize the information I collect, then that actually again reduces bureaucracy. So you are not playing not just a product development game, but like it's like creative bureaucratic problem solving, and that's actually a very big part in terms of like getting experimental products through. Identifying bureaucratic vulnerabilities and creative bureaucratic problem solving.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. I think it was really quite cool because you mentioned that your products are generally small in general, so that you try to go below the bureaucratic boundaries. And because of that, you're able to move faster and launch products and minimal viable products to the public faster as well. Yeah. Just curious if the other speakers have some similar thoughts to share on this as well.
Yeah, I think I can share a little bit about being experimental, right? I think sometimes it's just a mindset. I think there's this notion that experimental means fast. I think we can also conduct very long experiments, right? Like the Harvard age study. It went on for a couple of decades. So I just want to dissociate this experimental and fast. And we do have a lot of experimental mindset, right? I do apply it quite a bit in terms of the tools that we use, the open source things that we use. And some of this stuff, even though there are a lot of strict practices that we enforce in government, but there's really no much restriction in terms of the open source software that we use. It's only when we have to come to do with procurement, like Hongyi has shared, right? We do need to think about some of this creative bypass of bureaucracy.
Great, thank you, Kevin, for sharing. And I have a second question here by Lynette from Singapore as well. And her question is, a key tenet of tech culture is experimentation and iteration, which at base means learning from failure. But it can be challenging for governments to make mistakes in the public eye. How does GovTech grapple with this?
So I can talk about this briefly, unless Jiayi or like Kevin want to say something. So a big part of it is like, you're sort of trying to recognize that like, you're not trying to have this like sort of pristine image, right? You're recognizing that tech is inherently problematic. Everything about tech is inherently problematic. Like every single service from Google to like Facebook to every little app has bugs. And so you don't try to like start with the premise that we're going to plan to not have failure. You plan that you are going to fail and then like have contingencies around that, right? And so for every single one of our apps, like for example, we're doing a whole bunch of stuff right now around sort of like COVID tests and like managing these pipelines. You start with something that's crude and still very manual, and then you like improve it from there. And if you can look at yourself like a week ago, for example, like when we first started doing like some of these test management stuff, the labels were on separate pieces of paper and all over the place. Then you find a way of consolidating that. That's a way of like, that's an improvement that you make. And so the mental model has to shift entirely, basically that you are trying to get information about the ways that your stuff sucks as fast as possible so that you can fix it, rather than trying to pretend that everything is good, because once you embrace that, that's the fastest way you learn.
Well, I guess a lot of that is also having a lot of metrics involved, right? To know that exactly which part of the product is facing problems and we can fix it as soon as possible. It's a rapid iteration kind of process. Kevin and Jiayi, anything you'd like to add for this question?
I actually say I agree with what Hongyi said, and also I think my group we're composed actually all of ex-industry people, so we actually operate just like how industry would. So we move very fast, but also we sort of know what we're doing. I think the key behind it is we have people. The key is you need domain expertise. So if you have domain expertise, then a lot of the chances of failure, I'm not saying you can eliminate it, but it'll be dramatically reduced. And obviously for any kind of robotic stuff or sensor stuff we're doing, we do a lot of testing, right? We do a lot of testing, a lot of validation. So obviously you can never eliminate risk. I mean, that's impossible, but you can reduce it by a lot. Like you've seen what we've done deploying the robotic systems. It's not easy, I'll say, but so far we've managed to pull it off. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in a bit. I mean, even though I'm the moderator, but as I shared in Trace Together just now, we're running a lot of trials to fine-tune the algorithms. So whatever we kind of launched initially was the first version, and after that we got data, and from the data, we were making decisions to improve the algorithms along the way. And I think, as Hongyi and Jiayi were sharing, Hongyi's team deals mainly with software, as well as Jiayi's team deals mainly with the hardware components, but both sides can see that it's a lot of iteration and trying to improve from the first version that is being launched. I would like to move on from the topic of experimenting in government, unless someone else has something, last words to share about experimentation. All right, if there's nothing, let's move on to the next question. And this is a question about cloud for Kevin. So Zaishan from Singapore has asked, can you share more about how you envisage developers can work and collaborate on the SG government commercial cloud?
Yeah, so I think this question has to be seen in different angles, right? So just to be clear, the Singapore government commercial cloud is actually for public offices, as well for vendors as well that work on public application, right? So in that sense, you do need to be within the government construct to use the commercial cloud. And the way they use the commercial cloud is actually very similar to how they use the actual cloud itself, like as if you were locked into AWS. Maybe some of the processes are a little bit tighter because of the way government are more secure about certain things, but once you are really using the cloud, it's almost the same as it is. And I just want to raise the point that just now I did talk about the different layers, and one of it is the service layer. And while today we're still at the infancy of the service layer, but there's definitely opportunities as we think about this, right, to collaborate with external parties, either be it commercial parties as well as independent groups. So watch out for that space.
Cool, thank you, Kevin. And the next question we have is for Jiayi. And this question is from Asad, who is in Toronto. So his question is, my first question is about the autonomous navigation. There are efficient and accurate autonomous navigation packages in ROS. Have you utilized them? And how difficult did you find the adaptation process of using these open source packages in your environment setting? Well, I guess we can start with the first question first.
Yeah, sure. Very, very excellent question. Thank you for asking that. So the first thing I want to say, it's not really a rant, is for ROS, we don't actually use ROS that much in our group. We use some of it, but I think it's important to understand that ROS is essentially just a bunch of IPC nodes with a dependency graph. And yeah, there's a lot of nodes that's built on top of it to provide different functionality like SLAM, autonomy, VSLAM, even like operating LiDAR equipment, right? But ROS itself, we don't use that much because we care about performance. And we also care about deployment. So ROS is actually great for prototyping, but when it comes to actual deployment, we actually just rewrite all our stuff in a self-contained or a bunch of minimal libraries in C or C++, and then we write a lot of CUDA and GPU code as well. So for autonomy itself, obviously the question was, how do I find those packages? Well, I'll say open source packages are okay. But in general, they're also written sometimes by grad students with not very good code etiquette. And so I would caution against using them for production use. This is why a lot of companies, not all of them, a lot of companies for production code, they don't use ROS. They use ROS for prototyping, but when it actually comes to production of robotic systems, they start implementing it themselves because you need people who actually understand what they're doing. That's the first thing I want to take note of. The second question, let me see, you talked about the deep neural network DNN for, hey, let me see that. You talked about the DNN for face detection. Now, yes, so it's important to understand also, of course, that a lot of the pre-trained neural networks that you get online are only good as what they are pre-trained, right? So they're actually trained based on their data set. They might not be suitable for local conditions, local lighting conditions, and how people look locally. They're trained on whatever data set the person trained it on, right? So in general, if you want to get the best results, you're going to have to train it yourself on your own data set. You're also going to actually have to modify the architecture in our cases to make it run optimally. Because remember, we're not running this on the cloud. We're actually running this on the edge, on embedded devices, on low power devices, or even high-end devices, but we're running this on the edge. So you're going to have to be a bit more stringent about the kind of network architectures you're going to actually architect for your DNNs. Also, after you have actually trained the weights, when you deploy it, you're going to have to do tricks. You're going to have to quantize it. You're going to have to prune the network, whatever. And then when you actually deploy it, you're going to have to write in some native code as well on the metal. So there's a huge process in just getting DNNs deployed properly on an actual machine for production ready stuff, which also means we have to train ourselves. So the answer is no, we have to train everything ourselves because we care about quality.
Oh, thank you, Jiayi, for the very complete description of what you all do with open source code as well as in-house training models. Next question we have is from Wei Liang, who is based in London. And the question is, you mentioned tech evangelism across government services. Just curious about the kind of things you've done to evangelize adoption and what sort of challenges you've had in trying to encourage adoption. I think this is open to the floor.
Yeah, I can talk about this since I explicitly mentioned evangelism a little bit. So a few things, right? So there's the tech itself, which is sort of get people to use your product. And that's fairly straightforward. There's a lot of bureaucratic things where you get things to mandate and all that, but I find those to be sort of just be messy. You're just sort of pushing down bad product usually. What we find to be most effective is that you build something that solves some guys on the ground's problem. And if they are happy with you, a lot of other people will use it. So we spend basically $0 on marketing for Forms SG or parking and things like that. It's just that you solve someone's problem, and if you can do a form in 20 minutes and you can tell your coworker, that spreads really, really quickly. So that's just based on products, building products that people are happy about and solve people. That's the biggest way you can do tech evangelism. But that's obviously not everything. A big part of this is just, then there's how we run the team tech-wise. So in terms of our use of our cloud, how we run our infrastructure, how we do our code reviews, things like that. This is all stuff that, again, in established tech companies is fairly well documented, but in the public sector isn't. And so a lot of this is just being just taking the time to document how you do stuff. And so when people like your products and they look at your products and they say, oh, this stuff is pretty cool, how do you guys do that? You're well, this is how we do that. You have a nice written thing. So like I mentioned earlier, we have development guides, we have production guides, and these are also freely available to anyone in the government to share. And then finally, there's our practices, right? So as everyone knows, tech companies run differently from other companies. That's why they can do good tech. And so we have rewritten, we've written guides on, for example, how we do performance evaluation, how we interview, how we hire, how we manage teams, how what to look for in a manager, what are you trying to do in terms of your discovery process and your UX design process and things like that. And these are freely available as well. We've had quite a bit of success. The biggest challenge, I would say, in adoption is a lot of people will look at it and be like, oh, you guys can do that. You're techie people. I'm not a techie person. I can't do those things. And I mean, yes, there are some things that it helps to be techie, but it turns out a lot of this is just how modern organizations function. And so you're trying to get social proof in addition to sort of the sort of theory. So you have the theory on paper, and that gives them something to hang their hat on. And then you need to find social proof for them to take examples for. So for example, you need to find other teams in other governments or other small teams in government where oh, this team in your organization, let's say you're working with MOE, for example, right? There are some teams at MOE who are already doing some tech stuff, and you take that's way more persuasive to other MOE officers than you being outside of MOE. So those are some of the examples of the problems and challenges we get around.
Great. Yeah. I like that you mentioned some people think that it's very techy, how can we contribute and all that. There's actually a question about wanting to contribute to GovTech. So some people have asked, how can industry leaders with non-tech backgrounds work or consult at GovTech? And I think this is also open to the floor.
Kevin, why don't you take this since you're the one who does the more broad-based approach?
Yeah, I think for my space a bit unique, right? I work on a platform, so my customers are usually the developers, and they tend to be more techy. But if I were to imagine that if one of you want to contribute, I would think that try to use the product, right? Try to use the product and play with the product and figure out a little bit about how the product works. And because all of the product, you have some experience, right? It's like eating, right? Everybody eats something and they have something to comment about the taste of the food and things like that. And I used to work in Expedia, and we always joke about the UX design and things like that. Whenever they talk about this new design and clicking and all this, everybody suddenly becomes a UX expert. And I'm sure that this is one of the areas where everybody can contribute by just understanding the process. And even for my tech platform, there are areas where, like onboarding to the cloud, try onboarding to the Amazon cloud, and later on kind of onboard to the government commercial cloud. Tell me how bad or how good that is, right? What works well and what doesn't work well. And this is how you can contribute. So that's from my perspective.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, I think we've running about 5 minutes left for this Q&A, so just want to run some questions. One question here is from Charles. How does GovTech generally determine ROI for any projects since fundings are from the public? And I guess this is open to the floor as well.
So I can't talk about GovTech as a whole because it's a lot of different teams, a lot of different projects, but I can talk about my team specifically. So you're looking at ROI, like the problem with tech products is very hard to define ROI a priori because like you don't know what the product's going to be used for. You don't know where it'll be successful. And so a lot of this, it just has to be on instinct. Like you have to just figure out at the base level what you think will be valuable and try putting products there. But what you can do is you can look at after the products have gotten a bit of time to get traction on the ground, look at like total number of users and like amount you spent on it and see if that's reasonable, right? Like you can just do orders of magnitude estimations because tech is one of these things that's very hard to estimate at the intermediate level, but at the outcome level, you can estimate. So what I mean by that is, for example, for something like parking SG, right? Like we've got, I can't remember how many million parking sessions we have on the platform right now. But if I spent, $100 million on parking SG and I spent $100 per parking session, that would be absurd. And you'll be like, yeah, so I don't care how hard the tech is to build, but that's probably too much. On the other hand, if I spend like $2,000 and it's like a couple of cents per parking session, you can be like, yeah, that seems about reasonable. That seems to be something that's valuable. So you can't ever take the sort of human judgment out of it, but you can sort of anchor it in the quantitative numbers of what you're looking at. So for example, with go.gov, we got 2 people and we spend X dollars a month and we look at the number of people there and it's like, yep, that's pretty high impact. But there are some apps which we spend like they're really, really big government systems and we spend a lot of money on them and they don't get traction. And then you look at those numbers, you're like, well, that's probably not so good. We're not as good about this as we should be. My personal opinion is that we really should be tracking like outcomes and usage a lot more than we are right now. But there isn't a sort of simple ROI formula that you can follow. And looking for that, I think just leads you down the road to destruction. You do need to have like human judgment in it, anchored with just sort of like intuitive sense of how much have I spent on it? What impact has it has? And then exercise common sense and be like, yep, that seems about okay, or that's probably too much.
Yeah, I think this part I'd like to talk a little bit about. This part where the tech stack's a bit lucky, right? We can just copy from the industry and we measure the same kind of metrics. They're not really exactly ROI, but these are the metrics where we improve on that will give us a sense of how well we are doing. And for the tech stack metrics, we think about the DevOps metric, right? How fast we can release, how long does it take from a lead time from checking in code to the point it reached production, and how long does it take to recover from an error release, and what's the percentage of error releases. So in this sense, we are kind of aligned with the tech industry, what they are practicing.
Yeah, so personally for my group, what we're focused on actually developing core competency. And one of the things we care about is we actually so obsessed about is we do things not because it's easy, we do things because it's actually technically hard. If it's hard, then we're doing it, that's it. And it's not, this seems a bit frivolous, but it's not, because a lot of very difficult problems need to be solved, and they intrinsically have a lot of value. So I can give you an example. So I talked about the DOS robotic stack, and intrinsically it's just a robotic stack. Who cares, right? But it turns out it's a very difficult problem to even implement and solve. And while we're implementing it, all these use cases came up. Right? During COVID, there was a lot of use cases. Spot-on came out from that stack. And we had a very high performance neural network inference engine with the entire framework all built in that would never have come out if we didn't bother focusing on these difficult problems. So our philosophy in our group is we focus on problems that within our domain expertise, we try to solve them. And I'm not saying magically, but most of the time, very useful use cases with very high ROI comes out. My group's only 6 people. And we've already commercialized or licensed the first IP out to help local SMEs. So we've not only helped the public, but also helping local economy, the local economy as well in these very difficult times. Yeah.
Oh, thank you to all of you for your responses. I think we're left with about 2 minutes. So perhaps one last question would be, one message or advice for the audience for your outlook in 2021, or perhaps something that you're looking forward to in 2021?
Yeah, I can go first on this one. I think I really like to encourage all of you to start to reimagine Singapore government with code.
Yeah. For me, I would say that I think we're realizing how much of our systems were not sufficiently modernized and digitized, because prior to COVID, everyone was like, yeah, I guess it's chugging along. It's not great, but it's okay. And now we're realizing how much better things could be if we were to get all these systems up and running smoothly. So that's the big thing I think for 2021, which is that we've sort of have a more general awareness and consciousness of all the opportunities we have to make the public sector a lot better. And especially how important the public sector is. You've seen how countries who have this working right can do, and how countries who don't have this working right go. And it's really, really, really important to have a good public sector. So yes, if you ever thought about this stuff not being important, it is very important.
Yeah, so I think moving forwards to 2021, I think what's important to note is I think COVID has made us realize as a nation that it's extremely important for all of us, both public and private sector, Singaporeans in general, to develop our own capabilities. It's very important, and more important now so than ever.
Well, I think one final word from me would be, COVID has really happened in 2021 to all of us, but I hope that we can make it happen as well, to start to care and trust each other more so that we can all get through this together. And I would like to thank all of you for the great questions we received. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them. So on behalf of the GovTech speakers, thank you for tuning in and listening to us to share about the work that we do. It's been a pleasure to share, and we look forward to continuing the engagement on the virtual lounge, where we'll discuss and take more questions in the Product Spotlight-GovTech channel. See you all there.
Thank you, Kevin, Hongyi, Jiayi, Janice, for all the work that you're doing and making such a huge difference in our lives.